think that the concept of multidirectional memory can be a productive one in the German context, but of course it has to be adjusted to that context. In Germany, over the last couple of decades, a notion of how the Holocaust has emerged and become quite central of the Holocaust singularity and its uniqueness, and that this is a foundational aspect of German national identity. And it's very easy to understand why that's true, and it's important, obviously, for Germans to hold on to a responsibility for the Holocaust. But Germany today is a multicultural society in which a large percentage of the country has some sort of migration background and comes to Germany with experiences of many, many different histories, sometimes histories of trauma as well. And in that context, I think it would be useful to have a model that can both recognize the specificity of different histories, but at the same time see their relationality, see the dialogue that it can productively take place between them. And we don't have to give up on the specificity of the Holocaust in order to recognize that there's also an important history of colonialism in the German context, important histories of migration that deserve to be remembered alongside that of the Nazi genocide. I think it's obviously important for students in high schools as well as colleges to learn the specificities of different histories. So they need to know the history of the Holocaust as they need to know the history of colonialism or the history of migration. But I think that alongside pedagogy that stresses the specificity of those different histories, there's also possibility for thinking about the way these histories intersect with each other. And I think there are lots of materials out there in the German context as well as other contexts that allow us to think relationally, to bring histories together, and to think about what is gained by thinking in comparative ways about histories, so that we don't lose the specificity, we don't lose the empirical basis that we need for understanding, but we also open up history in a way that may make it more relevant for students who have themselves diverse backgrounds, right? Whose families have rich histories that come from places beyond Germany as well as in Germany itself. Came up with these two formulations, the German paradox and the migrant double bind, which I think are still very powerful from what I can tell in a lot of these discourses about the uniqueness of the Holocaust, the singularity of the Holocaust, and questions of multidirectionality. And that's on the one hand, this paradox that taking responsibility for the Holocaust seems to require preserving the ethnically homogeneous notion of German identity that lies behind the Holocaust in the first place. So there's a strong kind of reproduction of an ethnicized German identity that shows up in a lot of Holocaust commemoration and a lot of discourse around the Holocaust. And this eventually produces, in turn, what we call a migrant double bind. So this has to do with citizenship and belonging, right? To be German, you must remember the Holocaust, and for some good reasons, I think. But if you are an immigrant, you are simultaneously told that it is not your history. So I think these are powerful social logics, but at the same time, they in no way can cover up everything that's going on in Germany or has been going on in Germany. So while the German model of coming to terms with the past is in some ways quite self-consciously an anti-multidirectional model, what I would say is two things. One, I think it's ethically and politically crucial that German memory culture start to self-consciously and self-reflexively take on what I would call a multidirectional perspective. I'm sure there are other ways to talk about it as well. But I also want to suggest that a lot of those multidirectional connections are already there and already being worked on in some ways. And I'll try to show what I mean. But even beyond the very sort of self-conscious taking up of multidirectional histories, I want to suggest that there are multidirectional resonances that have been there all along. And this is partly what I was tracing in my book through connections between the Holocaust and decolonization. That's not what I've looked at specifically in the German context, in this project with Yasemin Yildiz, we're interested in the history of labor migration and its intersection with Holocaust memory. And I think you see here too, if you go back to the history of labor migration, that there were always resonances taking place, what I call resonances of the past, where where labor migration was being seen partly through a lens inflected by Holocaust memory or memory of the National Socialist period, to be a little broader about it. But I'm also hypothesizing that the grappling with National Socialism was itself inflected by the mass migration that took place in the post-war period. And here's just a small example of a VW general director in Wolfsburg in the early 1960s, talking about the guest workers who had been brought there to a place that used to, in fact, hold Fremdarbeiter and such in the National Socialist period, if I'm not mistaken. And he warns his employees, I'll read the English, not to speak and write about barracks and camps. The word camp can call up associations that in the interest of all involved, we would like to avoid. The term Berliner Brücke accommodations should be sufficient for all purposes. So on the part of majority society, I'm arguing, there was a sense of certain kinds of connections, historical resonances between past and present that were happening. And I think this was also true for the migrants themselves. And here's an example I took from an artwork by a Yugoslavian British artist, Margareta Kern, who came to Berlin and did an oral history project with women who had come as guest workers from Yugoslavia to Germany to work in factories. And it's a little bit small, and I won't read the whole thing. But the idea is that these migrants from Germany themselves had strong memories of the Second World War and of the German occupation there, and that they felt that presence in Germany very strongly. And if you read the quotation, if you have time to read it, you'll see that they also have memories of the Ottoman Empire, and it's a very complicated and I would say very multi-directional picture. So my argument is that German memory culture at some level has always been multi-directional, and the question now is to become more self-conscious about that fact.